Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, you're welcome here. Today's class is Adult Comparative Religion offering. Today's subject is Buddhism, and we're going to do this in several parts. So this one will be the introduction. I don't actually know how many parts or how many different lectures we're going to do on Buddhism, but today we'll introduce Buddhism and start. You have to start somewhere. So, I want to remind everyone about our course webpage. This is a good place to get all the past recordings, links to all the recordings, links to the lectures, links to the extra reading suggestions that I make in class. I put those on the webpage so you don't have to remember them. You don't have to write them down. They're on the webpage. You can go there and see all the books that I've recommended. Sometimes there's links to the slides if I'm not too worried about copyright sorts of things, and there's always links to the lectures. The URL for that is here. It's sites.google.com/view/comparative religion /home. And I apologize for that complicated URL. That's a pain in the neck, but that's what happens when you use free services to do everything, right? So sites.google.com/view/comparative religion /home. And sometimes if you search for James Carroll, UULA, and comparative religion, you may even be able to find me on Google, find the webpage on Google without memorizing all that stuff. I'm not sure. So when we talk about Buddhism, we've done a lecture on Buddhism once before. And this is what we have. It was a two-part lecture. Well, it was one lecture, but we had a break in the middle. So there's two YouTube videos. One on Far Eastern Temples, Part 1, Hinduism, and another Part 2, which was Buddhist, Chinese, and Japanese temple. And that was not really a discussion, although we had a brief mentions of the doctrine and theology. Mostly it was about buildings and structures and stupas and the religious meaning and significance of those symbols. So it was really a symbolism talk for all of those different temple buildings and mandalas, and which is a lot of fun, but it was not really a systematic study of Buddhism. So this is something I was going to circle back on. We circled back to Hinduism, and we had a full set of lectures on Hinduism. Now I'm going to circle back to Buddhism and do the same thing. But there is another set of lectures on both Hinduism and Buddhism you can look up if you're interested. Let's see. So we need to review. Now remember, last month we had a break after we did Hinduism. We had a break where we talked about religious studies as a discipline. So these courses have been primarily comparative religion, but we did do a religious studies divergence, and I did a section on Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Mircea Eliade. And the point of those lectures was to talk about the motivation for why I think studying comparative religion is interesting. And these are all three individuals who influenced the study of religion in the sense that they told us that religion is part of human nature. And so by studying religion, we discover something about ourselves, who we are, what it means to be human, etc. And this is why comparative religion is interesting and why it's worth studying. But to really review for what we're doing today, the review for Buddhism has to go all the way back to about 4 or 5 months ago when we talked about Hinduism. And Hinduism came in 5 sections. We had an introduction, and we talked about Vedic Hinduism. Then we had a lecture on Jnana Yoga, which is the path of wisdom. Then Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. And then we talked about sex, sexuality, and the divine feminine. And then we talked about modern Hinduism. So there's a whole suite of lectures on Hinduism. Buddhism comes out of Hinduism, much in the same way that Christianity comes out of Judaism. And you can think of Jnana Yoga as kind of the parent religion for Buddhism itself. So the lecture we had on Jnana Yoga is definitely relevant and is a good starting point. So if you want to go back and listen to that as an introduction, it sets the stage for what happens in Buddhism today. So that's that lecture. It was our Hinduism Part 2, Jnana Yoga. So, I'm going to review, because it's so important, I'm going to review that a little bit today. I'm not going to reteach all that, but we're going to go over it for just about 2 or 3 minutes, because it's worth describing remembering and getting that material back in our minds, because it's so important and relevant for what happens in Buddhism. So you remember, Jnana Yoga in the Hindu tradition believed in karma, which is this idea that our actions are like ripples in a pond, and they kind of reverberate off the sides and come back to us. So what we do, it's the idea of what goes around comes around. They also believed in samsara, which is this idea of reincarnation or rebirth. They would call it re-death because they were not so interested in being reborn after they died as the fact that if you were stuck in samsara or reincarnation, that you would be reborn, and that means you'd have to live, grow old, get sick, and die again and again and again, dying over and over and over again. Just as you would be born over and over again, you would die over and over again. So it was not considered a good thing. It was something to escape because it was a problem to be overcome. Moksha then was liberation from samsara, from this endless cycle of birth and death and suffering and misery. And the way to escape and the way to achieve samsara was through enlightenment or knowledge. The best text to describe this concept of Jnana Yoga is the Upanishads. Niels Bohr said, I go to the Upanishads to ask questions, and here's a recommended author. And this is a good read, it's very interesting, and it sets the stage for what they thought needed to happen to achieve liberation. Specifically, you had to have experience of the soul. And what was the soul? Well, in the ancient world, the soul was associated with breath. As long as you're alive, you're breathing, there's a wind that lives inside of you. When you die, that wind leaves, and that's your soul that leaves and goes somewhere else. Here we have this wonderful picture of this king being offered an ankh, a symbol of life, touching his nose. And they're giving life to the nose or the soul to the body, etc. And so from this there came this idea that the soul was a separate entity from the body. But they weren't quite sure where it happened when you die, depending on what religious tradition. Sometimes there was a heaven, as there was in Egypt. Sometimes it went to an underworld. There was a lot of uncertainty and contradiction about what happened to the soul, especially in the Vedic religion. But in the Upanishads, they came up with this idea of reincarnation, and a lot of that uncertainty disappeared, and it was that now you're born, die, born again in an endless cycle. And so as we move from the Vedic tradition to the Upanishads and Jnana Yoga, we get this idea of rebirth for the soul. But what is the soul then? Where is it? Is it the body? Well, no, the body dies and the soul continues. So if you go looking for the self, where do you find it? If you look for it in your finger, if you look for it in your nose, it's not any one place in your body, so that's not where it is. Is it in your mind? Well, the mind is a train of thought, constantly changing from one moment to the next. Your mind kind of happens to you. If you really observe your mind, which these people did in meditation, you realize that your mind isn't your own. Every thought you have is conditioned by the thoughts that came before it, in a long chain going back, and it's very hard to control, very hard to, you're not really in charge of your own mind. And when you try in meditation, you realize how hard it is to control your mind because you fail. So you sit down, you say, I'm going to meditate, and that means I'm going to concentrate my mind on this one thing, and then you fail to do that, and you realize the mind is not me. The mind is this other thing that I just can't control. So where is me? Well, the conclusion that the Upanishads come to and that Jnana Yoga comes to is that the Atman, the soul, is the Brahman, this grand universal God of everything. And so, in other words, we are God, and this is a pantheistic view of God, meaning God is all that exists, but all is connected in the individual, and the individual is in the all, and we're actually pieces of this God who is this all. And once we experience that realization, our cycle of birth and death will end, and our Atman will return to Brahman and become one with the universe. So this is where that joke, make me one with the universe, comes from. And so the idea is to realize through experience that you are one with the universe. And once you realize that, you escape the cycle of life and birth and death and rebirth and samsara. And that is how moksha, liberation, is attained. That's how you get it. Okay. And again, you can't just philosophically know that the Atman is the Brahman. You have to experience it yourself in deep meditation. So to achieve that, they would meditate, very, very concentration meditation. So they would focus on one thing, and they would try to focus their mind on that one thing until everything else but that one thing drops away, including the sense of self, and you would realize that you and the thing you were concentrating on were one, and you would experience God, and then you would be one with God, and then you would be one with the universe, and then you would escape life and death. So meditation was a key element, but you also had to give up your attachment to this world, because your attachment to the world ties you down to reincarnation and karma. And so they had a tradition of giving up everything and going out into the wilderness, putting on, orange robes, or sometimes they would go around naked, or they would do all sorts of very powerful austerities to try to convince their body that their body isn't worth it. And they wanted to separate the soul from the body and the lusts of the flesh. So they would fast, they would stop eating, they would do all these things to try to inflict pain on the body, to separate their soul and their sense of soul from their sense of body, and thereby achieve liberation. I love this kind of joke. What is the meaning of life? And he says, have you tried Googling it? Yoga is the process by which you achieve liberation. Yoga means to yoke. And so the idea is to yoke yourself with reality, to yoke the human and the divine, to yoke the Atman and the Brahman, the subject and the object, and to find connection to all these things. When we think of yoga as a bunch of stretching exercises, and that is one of the things that they did, actually. It comes through this tradition. But the exercises were intended as a meditative technique to achieve this idea of Atman and Brahman. And so, that's also why we called the path of wisdom the Jnana Yoga, or the wisdom's path to liberation. And there were several paths, right? There was the karma path, the yoga path, or the Jnana Yoga, the wisdom path, and the bhakti yoga, the path of devotion to a deity. And so these different paths in Hinduism led up the mountain to this state of liberation, several ways up the mountain. Now, Buddhism, that's my background. Buddhism comes from this milieu of Jnana Yoga. In other words, it took place, or it originated approximately at the same time as Jnana Yoga. And so at the time when the Upanishads were being written, Buddhism comes about. And you see a lot of connections between Buddhism and Jnana Yoga, and we'll talk about those connections as they appear. But there's a lot of similarities, and as we tell the story of the Buddha's life, we will see connections between this idea in the Upanishads and what the Buddha tries to do to achieve enlightenment, and how he eventually does it. Now, there's what we're going to try to do today is we don't have time to do everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Buddhism as a religion, as a modern religion. We'll talk about kind of where the people live and that sort of thing. Then we'll briefly overview the doctrine of Buddhism, very briefly, because we'll later have a whole lecture just on that. But I want to briefly give you an idea of what the doctrine is, and then we'll tell the life of the Buddha. And then we'll be done for today. We'll come back and we'll start with the doctrine, the doctrinal teachings of Buddhism, and we'll go through those, and we'll have maybe a lecture on how to meditate. We'll have a lecture on the different principles of the Eightfold Path, etc. So we'll come back to these things. But I want to give you at least a very quick overview to start. So, Buddhism is the fourth largest religion in the world. The largest currently being Christianity, then Islam, although those are set to potentially swap. Islam is growing and Christianity is shrinking. And then we have Hinduism, followed by Buddhism. So Buddhism is the fourth largest. At one time, we're not sure. We don't have a lot of good numbers from back earlier age, but we think that there was a time when Buddhism was probably a third of the world's population, at least in Europe, or not the Europe, but in the old world, barring the Americas. A third of the world's population might have been Buddhist at one point. It was a very large religion, but modernity has not been kind to Buddhism, specifically the rise of communism in China, the rise of Islam in India. Hinduism survived Islam in India in a way that Buddhism did not, and Buddhism moved east. And so Buddhism today is mostly practiced in Southeast Asia, and again, communism has reduced its numbers in China and Tibet. But at one time it was a much larger religion than it is now. It is growing, however, in the US, Australia, etc., where people sometimes see Buddhism as more compatible with the teachings of science. It's a religion that in some sense doesn't depend on the God proposition. And so a lot of people embrace it as a philosophy and even as a religion in the West. So it's growing in the West, and it's kind of, in the past, it has shrunk in the East, and we'll have to see what happens in the future. But it was at one time a much larger religion than it is today. And these are just some random percent numbers. 96% of the people in Cambodia. We have 93% in Thailand, 80% in Burma, 74%, and Sri Lanka, 69%. So these are kind of the high Buddhist countries. And depending on how you count in Japan, it's either 36% or 67%. So again, these are places where Buddhism flourishes in Southeast Asia. And it's a fairly large percent of the population in those places. So what are the fundamental teachings of Buddhism? Well, you know that I like to cover each religion this way. This was an idea introduced by Stephen Prothero in his book, God is Not One. It is a gem of comparative religious studies, not religious studies, but of popular introduction to comparative religion. If you want to know kind of the basics of world religions, this is the place to start. It's a very good book. And he likes to divide religions into problems, solutions, techniques, and exemplars. And what he means by that is that the only thing all the great world religions share is this concept that something is wrong with the universe. I don't know what it is, but something is wrong. I can feel it in my bones. Something is wrong. Where they diverge immediately is in what is wrong. We agree that something's wrong. We disagree about what it is, and then we disagree about what the solution to that is, and then we disagree about what the techniques are for achieving that solution, and then we have different exemplars of people who achieved that solution. So the religions really diverge almost immediately after that first point of contact. But by describing what that point of contact is, we go a long way to understanding kind of the fundamentals. And this is an oversimplification, but we have to oversimplify to grasp the broad picture before we can then drill down into the details and realize all the nuance. So at the risk of oversimplifying, I'm going to oversimplify because that's a good way to understand. In fact, you could almost define understanding as a simplification that grants insight into what's going on. So, Christianity. What is the problem? Sin. And sin has caused estrangement from God. So what is the solution? Salvation. And what is the technique? Faith and works. Salvation made possible through the atonement of Jesus Christ. Salvation, faith and works then are techniques for making that happen. And we have exemplars. We have Christ, the saints, the apostles, who showed us how to apply Christ's works Christ's grace in our lives so that we can be saved from sin. In Hinduism, the problem is not sin. They don't even believe in sin. They do believe in karma, but not sin. Sin isn't the problem. Karma is the problem, which binds us to samsara, so we have to escape karma and achieve moksha. How do we do that? Well, there's rituals, there's prayers, there's these yogas, there's meditation, insight, etc. And we have exemplars, the avatars, the gurus, etc. Those are our exemplars. So that's Hinduism. Now here's Buddhism. Buddhism believes in samsara, and for Buddhism, samsara is the problem as well. But in Buddhism, it's more explicitly suffering itself. Not just samsara that forces us to live again and suffer again, but our suffering in this life is a problem. We need a way to escape suffering in this life and rebirth. And frankly, if we could escape suffering in this life, then maybe rebirth isn't such a bad thing. Suffering becomes the key problem. Although escape from samsara is still an issue, escape from suffering is the core issue. The solution to that is enlightenment. Enlightenment means to be woken up or to realize something. In Buddhism, suffering comes about in part because of wrong views, confusion, mistaken beliefs. And so enlightenment wakes us up from that, and then suffering falls away in this life and in the next. Now, pain doesn't fall away. There's a distinction to be made here. If I stub my toe and I'm a fully enlightened person, put it this, if the Buddha stubbed his toe, would it hurt? Yes. Would he add to his suffering by going, my foot hurts? No. That's the suffering that we can get rid of. We can't get rid of the pain of the stubbed toe, but we can get rid of all this extra stuff we add to our suffering that's on top of that. And the way we can get rid of that is we'll talk about how that works. So, enlightenment is the solution, and it's that cessation of suffering. The technique for making that happen is embodied in what we call the Noble Eightfold Path. And the exemplars are, of course, the Buddha himself, the Arhats, the Bodhisattvas, depending on what variation of Buddhism you practice. So, you can do this for all these other religions too. We're not going to, but you can do the same sort of thing for all of them. But if we move from Christianity, which we are familiar with, to Hinduism, we see how different they are. If we move from Hinduism to Buddhism, we see the subtle shift in focus that takes place as Buddhism evolves out of Hinduism. In fact, you can even think of Buddhism as a Hindu sect, or a sect of Hinduism. So, let's... Traditional Buddhist beliefs. Of course, they believe in karma and samsara, mostly because the Buddha believed in karma and samsara, and the Buddha believed in karma and samsara because he grew up in India, where people believed in karma and samsara. But what makes them a little different is this idea of the Four Noble Truths. The first is the reality of suffering. And that's an important thing, because sometimes we go through life thinking that life is okay. And then we get blindsided when the bus hits us, or we get cancer, or we get sick, or our friend dies, and we realize the reality of suffering in this life, and also the reality that nothing in this life really satisfies. Nothing is satisfactory. And what we mean by that is nothing is good enough. There's a good psychological reason for that, in fact. If you think about what happens, your brain is designed as a machine to get you to do things. So you sit and you think, I should do this and then I'll be happy. I should get a degree. I should buy a new car. So you get a degree, you buy a new car, you land that job, you date the beautiful girl or the hot hunk, and now I'm going to be happy. And 5 minutes later, you're thinking of the next thing you want to do to make you happy, instead of being happy with what you just achieved. Why is that? Well, it's because that's what the brain is supposed to do. It's not there to make us happy. It's there to get us to do things. And so, nothing is enough. Because whatever we achieve, the brain wants us to do the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. So life is suffering, and the pleasures we seek, and the joys we find, and the things we do are just never enough. Not because they're really never enough, but because we're never satisfied with them, because our brain is constantly pushing us to do something else, to find the next high, the next joy. And then things go wrong. Or better yet, something hasn't gone wrong yet, but we worry that it might. So now you've found the beautiful girl that you always wanted, and you're dating her, and now you're worried and stressed that she's going to leave you. And so life becomes suffering, and desire becomes suffering. So the cause of suffering is desire. That's the next step. Desire for things to be other than they are, and false views. The belief that things are other than they are, and the desire for them to be other than they are. We want things to be permanent, at least we think we do. And then when they're not permanent, we're unhappy. Or we worry that they won't be permanent. Whereas in reality, if they were permanent, they would be static and would cease to exist to some extent. I mean, that's a very subtle point, but I want to drive this home. Let's think for a minute about our brains. Let's say I want there to be an eternal me. I want to find eternal life. That's what the Christians say we can have after all. Eternal life is what? Well, it's me. Well, what is me? There's got to be something there that doesn't change. Okay, so let's take my brain and let's stop it from changing. Well, the problem is my very consciousness is made up of movement in the atoms of my brain, the electrical signals that move around in my brain and fire. And if you freeze all that movement, I disappear as consciousness itself disappears. Change is required for consciousness to exist. And if consciousness exists, I'm constantly changing, and I'm not permanent, and I'm moving around, and there is no permanent, immovable, and unchanging me. There can't be, and we think we want something like that, but we wouldn't. Because it would mean the end of existence to some extent. So the cause of suffering is wanting things to be other than they are and seeing things as different from how they really are, namely thinking they're permanent when they're not recognizing that everything changes, that nothing is static. The next of the Four Noble Truths, truth 3, is that it is possible to end suffering. In other words, we often don't think that either, right? I want you to recognize that these things sound really simple, but they're actually fairly profound. Sometimes we don't realize that life is suffering until we're hit by the bus. Sometimes we don't realize where our suffering is really coming from. We think it's coming from the bus, and to some extent it's coming from our own reaction to the bus and belief that things are different than they are. And next, sometimes when we realize that life is suffering, we despair because we think life is suffering and there's nothing I can do, and so I should just give up, or I should end my life, or life is suffering and I can't escape, and it becomes very pessimistic. Buddhism is not pessimistic. It feels that way, but it's not, because it has this third truth, which is this ray of hope. There is a way out. Not just in the next life, not in a heaven you can go to, but here, now, right now, you can end your suffering if you want. There's a way to make it end. You can't make all the pain end, coming back to the Buddha stubbing his toe, but you can make the extra suffering we add on top of our pain end. There is a way to do it. And the path to do it is the Noble Eightfold Path, which is the way to end suffering. So those are the Four Noble Truths. The Eightfold Path, then, is the way. And we can divide it into 3 groups. One having to do with wisdom, one having to do with action, and one having to do with meditation. So the parts that have to do with wisdom are right view and right intention. The parts that have to do with action are right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And then meditation, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So notice, if you act right, if you think right, and if you meditate right, you can escape suffering. That's the Noble Eightfold Path, and we will later go into all of them, and we'll talk about what it means to have right view, right intention, etc. in another lecture. But the core of wisdom is this belief that the self is an illusion. Now, in Hinduism, we were almost there. Hinduism had already made the point that the idea of a separate self was an illusion because I'm actually one with Brahman, God, the universe, in a pantheistic sort of sense. In Buddhism, they actually go a step further and say the Atman is an illusion. It doesn't even exist, which is kind of a bizarre statement. In fact, it's the opposite of what you expect in Western philosophy, right? René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And from that core axiom that he thought was the axiom that you just could not disagree with, he built all the other axioms out, and he tried to use that as a core axiom from which he could build all of knowledge. And Buddhism says the very axiom, the root that Descartes tried to build everything on, is wrong. The self does not exist at all. And the analogy sometimes that is used is this chariot. So here we have an Indian chariot, and you ask the question, is the chariot the wheel? No, Master, the chariot is not the wheel. Is the chariot the spokes of the wheel? No, Master. Is the chariot the wood that attaches between the wheel? No, Master, that is not. Is the chariot the horses? No, that is not the chariot. Well, what is the chariot? And the realization is that the chariot is a collection of individual parts that have come together for a brief time and will not stay together forever and will then disperse. The self, what we think of as the self, is actually, by this view, a conglomeration of many different elements that are constantly changing, that have come together because of causes and are together because of those causes right now, and then will dissolve into other things, causing then other things. And it's a temporary sort of alignment of molecules that there is no self apart from the different pieces that make it up. And when you think this way, fear of birth and death vanishes, and then samsara and rebirth ceases, almost because you realize it was never there in the first place. It's the realization that it's not there in the first place because I was never born and I can never die because there is no me. But there is these pieces of me, but those pieces will continue because I will speak these words and you will hear them. And what was part of me influence now what is part of you, like a ripple in a pond. And those ripples will go on and on forever. And I am just a piece of that ripple that came from the past and converged now into these ripples, and then it will ripple on forward forever. I was never born and I will never die. Those things are illusions, as is the self. So this is this idea that the self does not exist, which is the key of wisdom. When we think of right speech, right actions, right speech, you can almost make a flow chart, right? Before you speak, is it true? If it's not true, don't say it. If it's true, is it beneficial? Well, if it's not beneficial, don't say it. But if it's beneficial, will the people you say it to accept it? If they won't, wait, then speak. If they will, speak. Which is very interesting because, it kind of belies all the arguments we have on Facebook. Why are we spending all our time debating with people on Facebook? This is a piece of right speech that I need to learn. We spend all our time debating with these people. Will they accept what we're saying? No. Then why are we wasting our time arguing with an anti-vaxxer or some other person who believes something crazy? So, next we have this meditation. Now, I think we'll probably have a lecture on meditation. We'll talk about how to meditate and all that stuff. But Buddhist meditation differs from Hindu meditation in that Hindu meditation's purpose was to create that experience of the Atman, to experience the self as one with the universe. And they did that with intense concentration. Buddhism has concentration practice, but it also has this concept of mindfulness, which is awareness. And if you concentrate too much, you lose your awareness. You become absorbed into the one thing you're focusing on. And so Buddhism backs up a little bit and says, yeah, you can do that. In fact, there's nothing wrong with developing that concentration. The Buddha did. But we need to also back up and just be aware of our body, to not lose our awareness. And through this awareness, we'll notice things like my thoughts are trains. There's a cause for my thought. Each thought comes from a cause and moves through to a conclusion, or not a conclusion, but the next thought that flows from the previous thought, that flows from the previous thought, that flows from this event that happened to me, that brings this other thought to mind. And you watch your thoughts, and you watch your breath, and you feel it come in, and you feel it come out, and you notice that it's constantly changing, that there's no self here anywhere to find. And the deeper you look with mindfulness, the more you become aware of the fact that the self is an illusion, because you see through the illusion when you watch your own self with mindful awareness. This is the concept and the idea. So this is Buddhist meditation. It has a little different bent than Hindu meditation. We'll talk about how to do it, and we'll probably have a guided meditation, and we'll actually practice in some things in a coming class. So what I've done so far is I've done the very simplest possible outline of Buddhist thought, philosophy, teachings, without going into detail. Now I want to tell the story of the life of the Buddha, and then we'll be done. And then next time we'll want to come back and we'll delve into the teachings in a greater depth and detail. So, the life of the Buddha. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and we don't actually know when he lived. Somewhere between 560 to 480 and 480 to 400, something like that. He lived about 80 years, and we don't know exactly when he lived. In fact, some people have questioned whether he was a real person at all, but that's par for the course. Again, my bias in all these things is that most myths, there are elements of the Buddha's life that are undoubtedly mythical and have been mythicalized, and stories have been made up that didn't really happen. But I tend to believe that most of those sorts of things arise from real events and real people that then just get embellished. So I think there probably was a real person, but whether there was a real person or not, the story is an inspiring myth that we can use to end our suffering, whether he really lived or not. So we're not sure when he lived. We're not even sure if he was a real person, although I think he was, and I think most people think that there was a real person. How many of the stories we tell about him are real is unknown. So the story goes that the Buddha's mother was the queen of a kingdom. His father was king, and she had a dream one night that a white elephant entered her side, and this was interpreted as a sort of divine birth or a portent of a divine birth, that the child she had was going to be special. Shortly after her dream, she became pregnant. When the child was born, she died in childbirth or shortly thereafter. The child was brought to his father, who raised him, and then she was raised by his father and his stepmother. So suffering was kind of woven into his very birth. His death of his mother from beginning. Several wise men came to witness the child. This sounds very much like Christianity. And they uttered a prophecy of the child's fate. Again, very much like in Christianity, there was a prophecy of what Christ would do. But these people said, a lot of them came and said, he will be a great king. He's going to rule after you and rule the world. And one of them finally came and said, one of two things will happen. He will either be a king who will rule the world, or he will be the greatest spiritual leader the world has ever known, and he will guide the world into spiritual bliss and enlightenment. And it seems like the other people were telling the king kind of what he wanted to hear. He'll be a great king. And this person came and gave both. And then he wept and said, I weep that I will not live to see, the Buddha, the enlightened one, teach the Dharma. And so I'm going to die before he grows up. And he wept and left. So we have this prophecy. And the king thought, well, I really want him to be a great king. So I'm going to make sure he's kind of divorced from religious teachings in life as much as possible. We're going to keep him separate. We're going to make sure he's not worried by suffering and make sure there is no suffering in his life. We're going to give him a beautiful life in the palace so that he can be a great king and rule the world, as this other prophecy says, and raise my kingdom to great heights, etc. So he found a nice wife for him. She was one of the most beautiful women in the world and very articulate and intelligent, and so the story goes, was very interested in philanthropy. She gave to the poor, etc., and tried to relieve the world's suffering by good works. She would go out and feed the poor people. The poor people suffer because they're poor, so she's going to feed them. And so she was very interested in philanthropy, and so the story goes, the Buddha was interested in helping her with that. In some variants of the story, he's well aware of suffering from the beginning, but in kind of the mythicalized version of the story, he had never really experienced suffering. His wife was pregnant, gave birth to a wonderful son named Rahula, and then he said, I'd really like to see the world outside the palace. So his charioteer, now if you remember our Hinduism lectures, especially the third Bhakti Yoga where we talked about the Bhagavad Gita, you remember the chariot driver turns out to be Krishna. So this character of the chariot driver is almost a cliche of Buddhism, of Indian literature. So the chariot driver takes the Buddha out into the city, and the king tries to orchestrate it so that he will not encounter suffering or anything and be kept safe, and so he won't become a monk. And while he's there, he sees an old person, and he says, "Chama, what is that?" The chariot driver in the church says, "This is an old person, Gautama. Everyone will grow old and eventually become infirm. This is the lot of all men. We all grow old." Okay. So he goes home to the palace and he thinks about the fact that he's going to grow old someday. He goes out again and he finds a sick person and he says, "Chama, what is that?" He says, "That is a sick person. We all get sick and eventually we'll get so sick, we'll all die." So he goes home and he thinks about sickness. A third time he goes out and he sees a dead corpse. And he says, "What is that?" He says, Venerable, this is a corpse. We will all die someday, all of us. And he went home and thought about the fact that his wife will die, his son will die, that he will die. And he realized the first kind of great truth: life is suffering. He went out a fourth time and he found a monk. And he said, "John, what is that?" He says, "This is a monk. He's seeking the path of liberation from suffering and death and rebirth and re-death through renunciation." And the Buddha, now remember we talked about this in the Hindu lecture, that's why I reviewed this, right? There was this Hindu tradition of leaving your home, of leaving everything and renouncing all of your possessions so that you could find liberation. And to get liberation, you had to give up your attachments. That was the Jnana Yoga path. So the Buddha sees somebody on the Jnana Yoga path, and he says, I want to do that because I would really like to overcome suffering. But I have a wife. I have a kid. This is another picture, sorry. This is one. In one picture, they have all three, right? There's the old man, the sick man, and death, and the monk over here. He says, I want to overcome death, or suffering, but I have a wife. I have a kid. But remember, he grew up in this tradition where it was normal to renounce your wife, your family, your duties, everything. His father wanted him to rule the kingdom after he was gone. He'd been raised to do this. If he left, he would be giving up his duty, he would be giving up his family, he would be giving up a wife that he loved and a child that he loved. But there was this idea that they suffer too. I need to find the way out of suffering, not just for me, but I need to bring it back for them. Because if I don't, they will suffer. I need to find a solution to suffering, not just for me, but so that my father will no longer suffer, my mother-in-law, stepmother will no longer suffer, so that my wife will no longer suffer, so that my child will no longer suffer. And he made a decision to leave while his child was very young and go out and seek the way. And his father tried to prevent him, so he snuck out in the night. This is another picture of him, that moment when he snuck out, and his wife Yasodhara was laying on the bed as if she was asleep, and no one knows, was she really sleeping or was she pretending? And this is one of those philosophical questions people like to ask, was Yasodhara sleeping? I think not. I think she was awake, because I think she knew he was leaving and was going to let him leave without a sad goodbye, so she pretended to be asleep. So the story goes. His chariot driver, again, saddled the horse at Yasodhara's instruction. She knew he was leaving, so she had him saddle the horse. Without even speaking to him, she knew he was going to leave tonight. Apparently she had a dream, etc. Anyway, the chariot driver rode with the Buddha to the edge of his kingdom that he was stood to inherit. And there he sat down and he shaved his head, cut off his hair, and traded his beautiful garments for some monk's robes from a hunter he found in the woods, and told the chariot driver to go home. And he struck out on his own with nothing but a pair of robes and a shaved head into the forest. And so this is a fairy tale, but it's an inverse fairy tale. Instead of a poor person who finds everything and marries a prince and becomes rich and famous, this is a rich, famous person who gives everything up to try to overcome, including a beautiful wife, a beautiful family, a palace of courtesans and entertainment and wealth and position, to try to find a solution to the suffering that he just couldn't get out of his heart. So he went and he sought all the great teachers, including Alaric Kalama and a whole host of others. These individuals, according to the story, taught him the states of concentration. So the first teachers he approached were meditation teachers who taught him the techniques of Hindu meditation, and he mastered them all, and he achieved these great states of concentration and enlightenment. And in fact, in some of them, he said his suffering dropped away like rain, and he would feel his unity with the universe, and then he would leave the state of meditation, and all of these suffering would crash back into him. And he said, this is great, but it doesn't solve my problem, because it only ends my suffering as long as I'm meditating. As soon as I stop, my suffering comes back. So he would move from one teacher to the other, seeking somebody who could actually take his suffering away, and none of them could, because they each taught him meditation techniques that brought him temporary peace, temporary relief, but not the permanent release he was looking for himself and his family. Eventually, he left all the teachers, deciding that they had taught him all they could, and he met 5 other friends, and together the 6 of them went out and said, we are going to find it on our own, because our teachers can't seem to give it to us or teach it to us. And they decided to try many different techniques, and eventually they settled on what we call extreme austerity, punishing their own bodies in an attempt to divorce their souls from their bodies and find escape from the body. They fasted, they starved themselves to death, they would inflict pain on their bodies, this sort of thing. And we see people in India today doing these very things. This is a typical Jnana path sort of approach. And the story goes that the Buddha meditated, did not cut his hair, did not cut his beard and grew long bearded hair. And you know all the fat Buddhas you see in Chinatown? This is the opposite. This is the emaciated Buddha who almost starved himself to death, living up in the mountains with his friends, trying to find a way to release suffering, and it didn't work. The more he fasted, the more his body screamed out for food. The more he tried to deny his body what it wanted, the more the body screamed for the things it wanted. And his concentration got worse. He became weak, and his mind wouldn't focus because his body was weak. So his mind was weak. And eventually he said, something is wrong about my approach. I am not making progress. Things are getting worse. I'm going to go back to the town and beg for food. So he washed his robes, couldn't get out of the bank where he was bathing. He was so weak, so he crawled out, holding onto a root branch, and crawled his way down to the village, and halfway there collapsed and passed out unconscious. And he was lying on the road, inches from death. He had starved himself so much, and he was so weak. When a young lady named Sujata approached, she turns out she was the village chief's daughter, and she offered him some rice and milk, but he was unconscious, so she dribbled the milk into his mouth and found him after she found him lying on the road. So the story goes, she had brought these things as offering to the forest gods, and instead she'd found this ascetic monk lying on the road, and she fed him and saved his life by giving him food. And then he went to a tree, sat under the tree, and said, I am not going to leave from this spot. Now, I don't think that means I'm not going to stand up from the tree, but he's going to stay here in this cool, nice place next to a river where there are people who can bring him food. And he says, I'm going to stay here until I figure this out. And he began to meditate under this tree. And he was there for, I think, something like 48 days. There's some long period where he stayed here. And during this time, he meditated. And Sujata brought him food. And he ate. And he said, I'm not going to starve myself anymore. And his strength returned, and his concentration returned, and his mindfulness returned. And he shifted his meditation technique towards a mindful approach, where he watched his body, and he watched the feelings, and he watched what was happening. And then he met this buffalo boy named Svasti. And Svasti brought him, would cut grass for his buffaloes. And he would bring the Buddha this, and the Svasti was an untouchable. And he would bring the Buddha these bundles of grass that he would weave into his meditation cushions. You see all the pictures. He's sitting on this pile of grass. This is the grass that Svasti brought him, while Sujata would bring him rice. And one day, he began to notice that the self was an illusion, that all things are connected, that all things interdependently co-arise. We'll talk about all these doctrines. And he began to pierce some of these doctrines and realize them himself, not as a revelation, not as a thought, but as something he experienced in his own mind by watching his own mind. And through his own experience of these things, he began to come to certain realizations about the nature of reality. And of course, then the myth takes off. Mara, the demon of confusion and mistaken beliefs, realized that his kingdom was about to be overthrown. So he assaulted the Buddha and tempted him with beautiful women and hordes of demons that tried to distract him, but the Buddha was undistracted. He reached down, and it says he touched the earth. So you see these statues of the Buddha where one hand is reaching down and touching the earth. That's all a reference to this moment of enlightenment. And he's grounded in the earth, and he touches the earth, and he says, the earth is my witness. I will not move from this spot until I have achieved enlightenment, and I will not give up, and you can't distract me, you can't dissuade me. This is the sort of thing we see in so many stories like this. From Jesus Christ being tempted in the wilderness for 40 days when he meets the devil and the three temptations are given, to Joseph Smith going into the forest and praying, and the devil appears and tries to dissuade him. There's even versions of this in Islam. This is a very common theme, that just before the spiritual moment, you get this assault from the evil one trying to prevent it. This is the dragon who guards the treasure. If you want to reach the treasure, you have to slay the dragon. So the Buddha overcomes Mara, and as the day star rises, Venus, the morning star, comes up over the horizon, he achieves enlightenment, sitting on the pile of grass that the untouchable boy had brought him. And His enlightenment was this moment when his own suffering ended because of the things he had realized he overcame, not his own pain, but his own suffering, the extra suffering he added to that we all add to our experiences by the sort of way we interact with the world. And then the children, the untouchable and the village chief's daughter, were the first to hear his teachings. He taught them as they came, and he told them about his enlightenment, and he told them how he had achieved it. And he taught them these sort of stories that little children can understand. And so the children were the first to hear his teachings while he sat under the tree in the village next to where these people lived. And again, I think there's importance to the fact that it's an untouchable child and also a person of high caste. The two children, the one that gave him the food when he was starving, and the other that gave him his meditation cushion that he used to achieve enlightenment. After teaching the children, he promised that he would come back and bring them, and bring Svasti at least. He could be a monk when he grew up. He says, you have to grow up first. But I promise I'll come back and visit you again. And then he left, and he went to find his 5 friends. Now, his 5 friends had given up on him because they saw him eat and drink. And they thought, he's given up. We're going to find liberation. And we're finding liberation by these extreme self-mortification, right? And the Buddha has given that up. We need to continue without him. So they had abandoned the Buddha. He went looking for them, and he found them. And he said, I found what's called a middle way. If you've heard the middle way, Buddhism is often referred to as the middle way. And what that refers to is this path between the extreme austerities that these individuals practiced, which the Buddha claimed actually weakens your concentration, and the practice the Buddha, at the other extreme, is indulging the body. If you indulge all of your desires and senses, you will never achieve enlightenment. If you punish the body and starve it to death, you will never achieve enlightenment. He says there's got to be a middle way between these two extremes where we can control our thoughts, control our mind, control our bodies, but not punish our minds, punish our bodies. We're going to find a middle way where we eat just enough. We don't overeat, we don't undereat, right? It's the middle way, and that's part of the path that he espouses, is this middle path. And he taught that to his 5 friends after finding them, and they achieved enlightenment themselves, so the story goes, almost immediately. And then he went out together, he and his 5 friends went out to teach others, and the movement, according to the stories, grew and grew and grew, and was divided into 2 groups. One, a bunch of monastic monks. These are called the bhikkhus, and these were the core followers of the Buddhas. They were monks. They would promise, for example, to do things like give up sex and to only eat 1 meal a day and own nothing but 3 robes and a begging bowl, etc. So this is the monastic tradition. So he begins a monastic tradition. But he also has what's called lay disciples. And the lay disciples are people who live in the world, who are married, who haven't given up sex, who eat more than 2 meals a day, who go to work in the morning and have jobs. And so he said that there were different rules for the monks than there were for the lay disciples. And so he opened up his teachings to both lay disciples and monks. But the monks were the ones who taught to the lay disciples, etc. The lay disciples would bring food offerings to the monks once a day, and they would eat, and the monks would then go out and teach and attempt to achieve their own enlightenment and then to pass that enlightenment on to others. And the lay disciples would build good karma for a better rebirth into a position where then someday they could be a monk and achieve their own liberation, or possibly achieve liberation themselves from the position of the laity. He had, according to the stories, many lay disciples who were kings of various nations actually followed the Buddha and became his lay disciples. And his conversion technique was he would walk up to people and say something like, I have ended my suffering. Would you like to end yours? Yes, we all want to not suffer. Well, let me show you how. And he would begin to show them how to end their suffering. And then he'd say, if what I tell you doesn't work, don't do it. If what I tell you doesn't work, don't believe me. Try it for yourself and see. And if it ends your suffering, then it works. And people would ask him questions like, is the universe finite or infinite? And he would refuse to answer. Because for him, his teachings were not a doctrine to be believed. They were something to be experienced for the specific purpose of achieving enlightenment. He told one person, if you were shot with an arrow, would you waste time asking who shot the arrow? Or would you just pull it out? And so asking, is the universe finite or infinite? Asking, is there a God or isn't there a God? Those questions are trying to figure out who shot the arrow. He says, who cares? Pull the arrow out. Let's talk about how to end your suffering. So it's a very practical sort of teaching. Again, when I say he said these, this is the sort of thing he was recorded to have said. He also said that his teachings were not dogma. They were a vehicle for achieving our own enlightenment. He has two very famous sayings. One was, the finger is not the moon, and the other is, the raft is not the shore. What he means by those is, the purpose of the teaching is to point at enlightenment, but the goal is to be enlightened. And the finger, meaning the teachings, is just, its only purpose is to point at enlightenment. But enlightenment is the goal, and they are not the same thing. So we need to be, he warned people to be careful not to interpret his teachings as dogmas, things that wouldn't change or couldn't change, and to not think of them as goals and ends in and of themselves. They were only valuable inasmuch as they were useful, specifically to help people achieve enlightenment. And so it's the usefulness of the teachings that matters. The fact that the raft can take you to the shore, that the fact that the finger can tell you where to look to see the moon, but you still have to look. And it's the moon you want to see, not the finger. If you spend all your time staring at the finger, you'll never see the moon. And so this is, again, the sort of thing that draws a lot of people to Buddhism specifically, because especially people who've been inundated with dogmas and doctrines where the doctrine matters more than the result of the doctrine. When we almost turn, in many cases, the doctrine into an idol instead of what the teaching is supposed to accomplish. There are wonderful stories about the Buddha's life. Some of my favorites, I just picked a couple. One where a very famous murderer was loose in town, and everyone said that the Buddha should go away because this murderer was killing people indiscriminately and stringing their fingers around his neck in a necklace. And the Buddha refused to go inside and hide. He went out begging as usual, and the murderer ran after him and said, "Stop!" And the Buddha turned around and says, "No, you should stop." And they kept walking, and he said, "What are you talking about?" And the Buddha said, "I stopped a long time ago." He says, "What do you mean?" He said, "I stopped causing harm to myself and others a long time ago. You're still doing it. You should stop." And the man said, "I've come too far to stop. No one would ever forgive me for what I've done. You know, I've committed these crimes and become an outlaw because I'm wanted by the law. No one would ever let me be. I've come too far to live in any other way. I can't go back if I wanted." He says, "It's never too late. Become my disciple and I'll protect you." So we did. So goes the story. He became one of the gentlest disciples of the Buddha, refused to harm anything, including the worms on the ground, etc., etc. And finally the king came looking for him with an army of men and said, and stopped the Buddha and his men and said, "I'm looking for this famous murderer." And he said, "Well," the Buddha said to the king, who was one of his disciples, that helps, he said, if this murderer became a disciple and monk, would you have need of all these men to arrest him?" He said, "No, of course not, master." He said, "Would you even want to arrest him if he became a monk?" And the king said, "If he became one of your monks and really followed the way, I wouldn't need to arrest him. But that'll never happen. So I need all these soldiers and men." And he said, "See this monk over here? That's him." And the king bowed and said, "Okay," and didn't arrest him, and he stayed as a monk of the Buddha, etc. Another one of these great stories, the Buddha slept in a temple once, and they warned him that a snake lived in the temple, and he should leave the temple because the snake was going to bite him, and it could be dangerous to sleep there. And he says, "No, I'll be safe." And he went and slept in the temple, and the snake slithered out of the wood pile and came over next to the Buddha, and the Buddha sat up and calmly meditated before the snake. And the snake reared up and looked at the Buddha, and the Buddha sat calmly, and then the Buddha said to the snake, "You should leave. The men here are afraid of you, and they're going to kill you if you don't escape." And the snake looked at the Buddha, and because the Buddha had been so kind to him and had not killed him, but had worried about the snake's safety instead of his own, the snake did not bite the Buddha and slithered out the door. You see the sort of stories that get woven around this sort of person. Finally, the Buddha died. He ate some food, either some meat or some mushrooms that were not good. It's hard to tell. Depends on which version of the story you hear. Speaking of meat, the Buddha taught his monks to be vegetarians because they didn't want something to be killed for them. But he also taught them that when you beg for your food from another person, you should accept whatever is given, if nothing is killed for you specifically. So if something has already been killed, you should take whatever they give you because they're trying to achieve good merit, and you should eat it. But you should never take meat. So this is the balance between eating meat and not eating meat. And so the story goes, the Buddha ate some meat that was not good, it spoiled, and became sick and died in a forest. I don't know the names of these places are difficult to remember. And so they built monasteries in all these places where he visited, obviously, because that's what you do. Anyway, after he died, supposedly his last words were, "Be diligent in following the teachings," etc. And after he died, they cremated his body, and they took the ashes and divided them into several pieces, and then they sent these pieces out into the different places where the Buddha had lived and taught, and they built stupas or Buddhist temples over each of these spots with urns of the Buddha's ashes as the sacred relics for these sacred temples and monasteries. So that's the life of the Buddha. After he died, presumably one of his greatest monks was named Ananda, and Ananda never achieved enlightenment after spending most of his life with the Buddha. However, he was renowned for his memory. Of course, you have to have a reason why all these teachings are written down and accurate. Well, according to the story, it's because Ananda had this amazing memory, so amazing that all the bhikkhus told him that he had to go everywhere the Buddha went and listen to every sermon the Buddha ever gave anywhere, because it was his job to remember them all word for word and write them down after. So that's Ananda. And then after the Buddha died, Ananda finally achieved, he was so moved by the Buddha's last words of diligence, etc. Finally, he achieved his own enlightenment. A few months after the Buddha's death, I believe. So he'd been with the Buddha his whole life. He'd heard the teachings his whole life, but that wasn't enough. In fact, he knew the teachings better than any of the other monks, but he had to have his own experience. And he had that experience after the Buddha died, and then he was involved in writing down, and this is why presumably we have all the teachings of the Buddha and all these stories about his life, because Ananda wrote them all down or helped them all be remembered by the other monks. So this is the life of the Buddha and the origin story of Buddhism itself. I'm not sure how much of this is historical. As I said, I probably think there was a real person who probably through meditation came up with a way to reduce his suffering, if not eliminate it. And hundreds of people, thousands of people the world over have tried the techniques he suggested and claim that they have reduced their own suffering. In fact, this is at least a practice that so many times I teach things that aren't involved, that I'm not personally involved with, because I want us to know what other people think and believe. This is one of those things that I actually do as well. Not because I believe it as much as because it helps me overcome my suffering. This is something that makes me happier, so I do it. And I don't follow everything. I'm a cafeteria Buddhist in the sense that I pick and choose the pieces that help me the most, and maybe I'd be happier if I did more of them, I don't know. But I can tell you that my own life has been made better by these teachings and through the inspiration of this story of this man's life. And again, I don't know how much of it is fiction, but to some extent it doesn't matter. This is a story of a person who gave things up to help make other people happy. And I should have mentioned, so goes the story. He went back to his home, found his mother, found his wife, found his son. His son became one of his disciples. His wife became a nun, and he taught them how to end their own suffering, and they achieved enlightenment because the Buddha went out and found the way and brought it back to them. So this is the way the story goes. So it's an inspirational story. It can bring inspiration into lives, but the teachings and the practices of meditation are useful. And in fact, mindfulness meditation has now been kind of mainstreamed by the psychological community, because therapists and psychiatrists have realized that this is something that you can do to help overcome PTSD and this sort of thing, because it works. And so again, I think this was probably a historical individual, but we don't know. And even if there was, how many of the stories told about him are real? Did he really sleep with a snake? Did he really stop this murderer on the road and say, "You should stop"? When the murderer told him to stop? I don't know. But I think there was somebody who had practiced meditation in the theme of the Jnana Yoga Hindu tradition and came to certain conclusions that he felt were helpful. So if you want to learn more about Buddhism, we're going to have more lectures, obviously ourselves, and we'll talk about the doctrine and the teachings. But I also created an annotated bibliography of Buddhist writings that I have read or that other people in my meditation group have read. And I collected some of these books. Most of them I've read, some I haven't. And I put together an annotated bibliography on several themes or topics. I'm going to show you some of them just because I want to give you some examples of things you can read, especially if you're interested in the life of the Buddha. Old Path, White Clouds by Thich Hanh was the book I read in preparation for this lecture. So this last month, this was my book of the month. To get ready to teach the life of the Buddha, I read through his account of the life of the Buddha. You can think of this as the Buddhist New Testament. The difficulty, of course, is that the stories of the Buddha each come from hundreds of different sources in different places. So here we have somebody who's compiled the entire thing into a cohesive story that sort of makes some sense, which makes it useful to read and digest. Let's see. I'm sorry, clicking the wrong thing here. If you want an introduction to Buddhism itself, again, I recommend Stephen Prothero, God is Not One. I've already recommended this book many times, but he has 2 chapters on Buddhism. And so if you want a really short overview to Buddhism, this is a great thing to read. You can get it, have 2 chapters on Buddhism and 2 chapters on Hinduism and a chapter on Judaism and a chapter on Christianity and Islam. So this is a very useful book for introduction to comparative religion in general. And again, 2 great chapters on Buddhism. This is a great introduction to Buddhism. This is the Upanishads. This is the translation of the Upanishads I have anyway. Eknath Erswaran, I think is how you say his name. And I love this because he's got a good introduction that explains the significance of the text, and also he introduces each chapter in reasonable ways that are very useful and tell you what the significance is. He did his own translation of the Dhammapada, which is a collection of the Buddhist teachings. It's also useful. He also did a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. I have 2 different copies, one given to me by some people in an airport with flowers, and the other is his translation, which I prefer because it's got this nice introduction. Joseph Goldstein also wrote a book on mindfulness, which is about how to meditate. It's very good. And he also wrote One Dharma, the Growing Western Buddhist Tradition, where he talks about the history of the different fragments of Buddhist traditions, which was something we will have a discussion about. The history of the different sects of Buddhism, etc. This is also really good in that sense. This is by Malcolm David Eckel, called Buddhism. It's one of the Great Courses lectures. I've listened to this from start to finish. It's technical. It's an overview again of the different sects and the evolution of the tradition up to the present time. So it doesn't spend as much time talking about the Buddhist teachings as it does talking about the evolution of the different sects. Mindfulness in Plain English is a very useful book on how to meditate. So this is, in fact, the best meditation introduction that I've so far seen. It's not perfect. I think I would do it differently, but it's useful as a good introduction. In fact, when I first came to the meditation group here at the church, this was the book that John gave me when he said, "You want to learn how? This is where to start." So this is the first book on Buddhism actually I read. Buddhism Without Beliefs is by Stephen Batchelor. This man is an atheist who is also an ordained Buddhist monk and ascetic. Every once in a while he comes on speaking tours and actually comes here if you ever get a chance to come listen to him. But he also writes several books. If you're interested in Buddhism as an atheist sort of perspective on how to be a practicing Buddhist and to use Buddhist teachings, even if you especially if you don't believe in God, etc., this is very useful. And Buddhism is amenable to this because the Buddha talked about achieving your own enlightenment through your own efforts of meditation and concentration, etc., in a sense, in a way that is independent of God. So it's very clear the Buddha probably believed in gods, etc., the Hindu pantheons, but his path is practically atheist in the sense that the existence of the gods is not important for the things he taught. It's just background. And so the things you do are apart and aside from the deity. And so Stephen Batchelor talks about how, as an atheist, he finds meaning and purpose in this tradition and happiness. This one is by Jonathan Haidt. I know I recommend this book all the time, The Happiness Hypothesis. I should say I read this before I read the other one, the Mindfulness in Plain English. The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt is by a neuroscientist and a positive psychologist, and he talks about the things that the different religious traditions have in common that lead to happiness, including Buddhism as one of the many things he lists. And so this isn't primarily about Buddhism, but one of the things he said that was interesting, he said, when people struggle with depression, there's 3 things we do. You can give them medication, you can give them talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or you can teach them mindfulness meditation. And he said all 3 of those have about equal success rates in the different studies. This is his claim at least. And so that means meditation works about as well as medication. And he says, in fact, some of these things will work for one person and not another. And meditation will work for somebody that medication won't work for, but medication will work for somebody else that meditation doesn't work for. So he says all 3 of them are useful and things. And so this book caused me to go to the meditation group and say, I'd like to learn to meditate, which is when John gave me the other book on how to meditate. So although this book isn't primarily about Buddhism, it mentions Buddhist ideas in this larger milieu of how to be happy. This book is the one for next week, or next month. Next month's class will be on the teachings of the Buddha, which are Buddha-loved lists. The 4 noble. You might even notice that already. The 4 noble truths, the Eightfold Path, and then you'll get the 28 marks of enlightenment and the 27 signs of the rising star, and you get the 4 diamonds. And the Buddha loved lists. This book goes through those teachings and kind of talks about each one and the implications. Got a chapter on each of the 8 parts of the Eightfold Path, and then it has chapters on each of these different ideas. And so this is the sort of stuff we'll talk about next time. So if you wanted to read it, you'd know everything we're going to talk about before we came. But this is the book we'll kind of, or the material in this book is the stuff we will discuss next lecture, which is what I hope to see you at next month. Although I apologize, I need to think through this. Next month is, on the day my lesson would fall, is Pride. And so we're going to be doing that instead of this. And so it'll be 2 months from now, and we'll be covering this material. So you have 2 months to go out and read this book if you really want to know more than I do by the time you get here. So I will see you in 2 months for this topic. This Sunday, I want to remind you, is the Biblical Scholarship and Literacy class. We're going to be talking about the life of Joseph in Egypt. And so I'll see you, some of you, this Sunday, and I'll see the rest of you in 2 months for the teachings of the Buddha in greater detail. Thank you for coming. See you next time.